and then after she'll take questions. And if you want to just raise your hand, I'll be happy to call on you.
Great. Well, thanks, Reed. And thanks, everyone. As most of you know, but it seems like every week we might get a few new folks. I'm Meagan Wolfe. I'm the administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission and the state of Wisconsin's chief election official. And also, like Reed said, we're going to jump into questions and answers in just a bit. But I do try to provide some information about timely things that are happening right now. I think our goal in doing this every week are to make sure that we're putting out content that our voters are looking for, right? Voters really want to know about the mechanics of elections. They want to know what the expectation is for them to navigate the process so that they can be successful. And we've seen that time and time again. Voters are just really hungry for the mechanical information about elections. So it's not always the most interesting. It's not always the most click-worthy, but I think it's incredibly important work that you're all doing to help us convey this really important information to voters, and every week to bring them information about what they need to know to navigate the election process in the state of Wisconsin. So thanks as always for your engagement on these issues. It's greatly appreciated. And I think the fact that you're willing to show up for these every week is really important. So thank you. So the first thing I wanted to talk about today is how to get a photo ID or photo ID requirements here in the state of Wisconsin. So the state of Wisconsin, a photo ID is required here to participate in elections. A few reminders about photo ID, what can be used. There's a lot of myths around the photo ID process and requirements that voters may think exist that don't. So first, to start with, what can you use as a photo ID in the state of Wisconsin? So in Wisconsin, you can use a Wisconsin DOT issued ID card, a Wisconsin DOT issued driver license. Again, both of those products have to be issued by the state of Wisconsin. You can't use a driver license from another state or an ID card from another state. There are also some nuances to the type of driver license or the type of photo ID that you can use. So some, there's certain exemptions for folks that might have a religious objection to being photographed, where there's actually driver license and IDs available without a photo. But as long as it's a Wisconsin issued ID and identification card or driver license, that is acceptable. And it has to be unexpired or expired since the last general election. So expired since the 2018 general election, November of 2018 general election, it can still be used to vote in Wisconsin elections. You can also use a military ID card issued by the U.S. Uniformed Services. So this is that Department of Defense ID card that's issued if you're a member of the military, the U.S. military, or if you're a dependent spouse. Sometimes you'll also receive a card along these lines as well. You can also use a U.S. passport. So let's say somebody doesn't have a Wisconsin ID card, but they do have a passport. That's something that they can use. They can also use an identification card that's been issued by a federally recognized tribe. And so that's an option for folks as well. A photo identification card can also be something that's issued by a Wisconsin accredited university or college. And it does need to contain some information from those students that are using it. And it also has to include some type of document that proves that the student is currently enrolled in that school as well. And then there are also some requirements. There have been some adjustments to the requirements for what needs to be on that particular ID as well. Some important notes about ID. And so again, to kind of get into those mechanics and some of the myths that we see around photo ID laws in the state of Wisconsin. So first of all, your photo ID is for receiving your ballot, and it does not have to have your current address on it. So the poll worker, the clerk receiving your request, they're not looking for a current address on your photo ID, right? The address verification process, that happens during voter registration. So when you register to vote, that's the point where you're proving where you live. You have to provide a proof of residence document and get registered in the right districts and wards. And that solidifies where you live and where you're eligible to cast a ballot. When you're showing your photo ID, that's when you're proving who you are, that you're the one requesting your absentee ballot. You're already registered, you've already proved where you live, You've already proved that you have residence there and you're eligible to get that ballot. So when you show your photo ID, it does not have to have a current address on it. And I think one of the examples that helps to illustrate that for people is a passport. Passports don't have your address on it. And so that's not one of the fields that the poll worker or the clerk is looking for on those ID cards. We also know that a lot of Wisconsinites, they might update their address with the DMV, but they don't get a new card that has that address actually printed on it. So it might be on file with the DMV, but it's not printed on your ID. That's okay. You can still vote using that photo ID, even if it doesn't have your current address on it. What the poll worker and the clerk is looking for on your photo ID is they're first making sure that it's one of those acceptable IDs that we just talked about. They're then looking to make sure that your name reasonably conforms to the name that's on the poll book or in your voter registration record. So let's say your name is Robert, and your registration says Rob and your driver license says Robert. That's okay. That reasonably conforms, but it has to reasonably conform so that they can prove that you are the person on that ID. They're also looking for that expiration date. So each of those IDs has its own expiration date, like the driver license or the state ID card. It can be since the last general election. So they're looking for that as well. And then they're also making sure that your photo reasonably resembles you. So people's hair color can change, some of their, other features can change, but it has to reasonably resemble the voter enough for them to be able to determine that it is indeed you. Another thing that we hear sometimes that people are confused about is, does it have to be a real ID? And by real ID, I mean the ID that has the star in the upper right-hand corner that can be used for entrance in federal buildings, maybe to airports. It has to be a real state of Wisconsin ID card. It certainly can't be a fake one, but it doesn't have to be a real ID. It doesn't have to have that star in the upper right-hand corner. As they say, star or no star, you're still good to go in terms of voting. That's not something that they're looking for when they're looking at that photo ID. They're not looking for that star. So if you have one or if you don't have one on your ID, that's okay. You can still use that for voting in the state of Wisconsin. If you don't have an ID card, so for voters that might be thinking about getting ready for the election, they want to vote in person or they want to vote by absentee, what are their options? So if a voter does not have one of those acceptable photo IDs to vote in the state of Wisconsin, you can actually get a free ID card from the Wisconsin DMV. So when you apply for a ID card at the DMV, you'll see there's a box on the application that says you'd like to get that ID for free for voting purposes. You can check that box and then you'll be issued a credential that you can utilize for voting purposes in the state of Wisconsin. Also, let's say a voter wants to get one of those free IDs, but they also don't have some of those documentations that's typically required to get a driver license or a state ID. So they don't have a birth certificate or they don't have a social security card. They should still go to the DMV and they can go through what's called the ID petition process. So that's the photo ID petition process, which means that that voter can bring whatever they might have that proves who they are, whether it's an old, outdated credential or other documentation. They should bring whatever they do have to the DMV and they can still issue them a credential. They have to issue it by mail because there's a little bit of research that they have to do after they get that documentation, but they can issue that voter a voting ID and they'll send that to them by mail, even if they don't have some of those documents like a birth certificate or like a social security card. So really, for voters that are thinking about this, getting ready for election day, there are options for everyone. The DMV is happy to help voters through that process to get one of those credentials, and we are too. So voters can, of course, go to our websites. The one that talks about photo ID is bringit.wi.gov. You can learn all about photo ID, the ID petition process, the free ID process is all right there. And you can also call our office, and our toll-free number is 1-866-VOTE WIS, so 1-866 vote WIS, and we can also help voters navigate that process and figure out what their options are for photo ID. And then there's always provisional ballots too. So the law does provide that if you do not have the photo ID that you need on election day, now we encourage everybody to make sure that you've got that ID that you need to vote, get prepared before election day. But if you do show up on election day and you don't have the photo ID that you need to vote, you can cast what's called a provisional ballot. And a provisional ballot means that you'll be able to fill out a regular ballot, but you'll seal it in a provisional ballot envelope. And then you have until 4 p.m. on the Friday after the election to bring in your photo ID to remedy that provisional ballot, and it'll still be counted with the official totals. So even if somebody had to go through the ID petition process or needed to go get one of those free IDs, they would still be able to do so if they went to the DMV right after election day and were issued that voting credential, which they then could bring into their clerk's office and have their provisional ballot cured and still have their ballot counted as part of the official total. So that's a little bit about photo ID. You know, all 3 ways to vote in Wisconsin, you have to provide a photo ID. So whether or not you're voting in-person absentee at your clerk's office, that process starts on October 20th in all of our 1,850 communities, whether you're voting at the polls on election day, or if you're voting absentee by mail, a photo ID is required. Now, some of the rules are a little different with absentee by mail. Whenever you're appearing in person, the rule of thumb is that when you appear in person, you've got to show your actual ID card. So you've got to show the card itself. You can't show a copy when you're in person. You can't show it on your phone. You have to show the actual ID card when you're voting in-person absentee at the clerk's office or when you're voting at the polls on election day. When you're voting absentee by mail, you can make that application either through myvote.wi.gov. You can make it by email to your local election official. You can also submit it by mail if you'd like to your local clerk's office as well. And when you submit your request to get your ballot by mail, you also have to provide a copy of that photo ID. So if you're submitting your request by mail, you're going to have to take a photocopy of that photo ID and send it in. If you're doing it electronically, you're going to have to take a picture of that photo ID and attach the file to your request. MyVote, if you use mobile MyVote, you can just use the camera on your phone and take a picture of your photo ID. But all voters are required the first time that they request an absentee ballot to submit their photo ID. Your clerk then keeps that on file for all subsequent requests, right? So if you already put your photo ID on file for your absentee ballot last year or earlier this year, and now you're requesting one for this election, you don't have to provide another one unless you have moved, unless you have changed your name, or unless you have re-registered or are a new registrant for any reason. When you're re-registering, you're going to have to provide a new copy of that photo ID. There is also an exception for voters that are indefinitely confined. So the law says that if a voter certifies that because of age, illness, infirmity, or disability that they are unable to appear at the polling place, then they're able to receive an absentee ballot by mail, and a photo ID is not required in that circumstance. So that's photo ID in a nutshell. But again, we really want to get people thinking about that process now, thinking about that requirement as they're looking ahead to in-person absentee or election day, and making sure that folks have enough time to navigate that process and know where to go to get information about that process as well. So absentee ballot requests. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, we try to do an update every week. As most of you know, we also have information we post to our website every single morning about absentee ballot requests and where we stand in the state each day. And so as of this morning, there are over 1.3 million absentee ballots that have been requested by voters in the state of Wisconsin. And just shy of that have already been sent. So as clerks get those requests, they're sending those ballots out to the voters. And then as of this morning, we also had about 62,000 of those absentee ballots that have already been returned to their local election official as well. And then the final thing I wanted to touch on too, and I know we talked about this last week as well, but is just poll worker recruitment efforts. So, we're just continuing to encourage folks to volunteer as poll workers. There's some communities that have reported to us that they have enough poll workers, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't still contact your clerk, right? There's a lot of other communities that may be just outside of your community that could really use the assistance. And so please do contact your clerk if you're willing and able to serve in that capacity. It's a really incredible way to be able to serve your community, to be able to serve your fellow Wisconsinites, and to make sure that we have what we need to run democracy here in our state. And so thanks to all the people that have volunteered to be poll workers. We hope that people continue to volunteer to contact their local election official. You can go to myvote.wi.gov. You'll see one of the promotional items is become a poll worker. If you click on that, you can contact your local election official and let them know you're interested. We're also working with our local election officials to collect information about their needs for poll workers. So now the closer we get to the election, the more they have a handle on who's going to be able to serve or if they still have some needs. And we're asking them to plan not just to have enough, but to have a backup that they can call upon in the event that somebody's not able to show. And so that's, again, why it's so important that we continue to get those volunteers around the state. And we'll be sharing that information in terms of critical and serious needs that our communities are conveying to us, and we'll be posting that next week. So we're going to be posting that on the elections.wi.gov website so that voters, so that groups that may be working to recruit poll workers are able to see that, and they're able to see contact information for those clerks that are indeed reporting a need. So I really believe in us as Wisconsinites and that we can do this, that we're going to have enough poll workers, that we're going to be able to get those volunteers. We need more poll workers than ever this year, right? A general election requires 30,000 plus poll workers around the state to be able to operate the elections, especially in-person processes. This year, in so many ways, it's almost like on election day at our polling places, they're running 2 elections, right? We're already seeing over a third of our anticipated turnouts of folks that have requested an absentee ballot by mail. So you're running that in-person process, but you're also processing all those absentee ballots, because processing those can't start until 7 a.m. when the polls open on election day. And so you're going to need more volunteers than ever to make sure that we have what we need to run those polling places efficiently. So with that, I think that's everything I wanted to cover quickly. Thanks for listening. I'll turn it over to all of you for questions.
Meagan, one thing, when you were talking about the number of absentee ballots that have come back already, the number is about 614,000. Thank
you. As soon as I said it, I'm like, that's not right. So thank you for the correction.
No problem. Anybody have questions? Feel free to raise your hands. Here, let's see here. Okay. Let's start with Casey Nelson. Casey, go ahead. We can't hear you. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Just a question in regards to the poll workers here. You said 30,000 plus are needed for a usual election, for a typical election. How many are we seeing? And I know you said those numbers will kind of come out next week, but do we have any idea of how many are out there across the state and how many openings are still out there across the state?
Yeah, we really don't, because we have 1,850, municipal clerks. So in each city, town, and village, they're recruiting those poll workers. They're figuring out, who's going to be able to serve and where they still have needs. And so they have told us in the last few weeks that was too soon for them to know for sure. But we're now asking them to really tighten up those calculations and provide us with any reports of needs. So I don't have any even estimate at this point. But I see another question in the Q&A, which I think is helpful at this point too, which is that I do think it's more rural areas that are seeing a need, right? In a lot of our small communities. So of those 1,850 municipalities, over 1,200 are townships, and these are our smallest jurisdictions. And, you know, there just frankly aren't a lot of people that live in some of those small townships, right? And so the pool of people that are able to serve those communities is smaller. So they often have to draw from the larger community, especially when we're talking about backup sort of people that might be needed in the event of an emergency, if somebody gets sick or something else happens. And so I do think that's the case. But also, you know, you have places like the city of Milwaukee, where they also have a Spanish language requirement, where at many of their polling places, they need Spanish speakers to be poll workers as well. So, you know, I think that there's always needs in all of our communities because some of their needs can be unique. So I would encourage anybody to reach out to your local election official if it's something you're willing to do. There's also a court decision right now that I hear we just got some news there. I haven't had a chance to even look at it yet since I've been on this call, but that does discuss the residency requirement for poll workers. And so if there is a lift on the residency requirement of poll workers needing to serve in their community, I would say even more so, it's really important for voters to contact their clerks, even in those communities that might have enough, because they might be really needed in surrounding communities as well. So I promise as we get more information, we'll keep bringing it to you, and we will post it publicly too, so people know where those needs are.
Thanks, Casey. Next is Laura Schulte.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Awesome. So we've had some readers asking questions about potential intimidation on election day at the polls. What will be done to prevent intimidation of voters who are physically voting in person on November 3rd?
Sure. So, you know, just like always, you know, there can't be disturbances or intimidation that's happening at the polls. And if there were something like that, the chief inspector is the one in charge of those polling places that would engage any other resources needed to resolve that disturbance. But, you know, I will say that we're talking with our local election officials on a constant basis. We're talking with our partners at the state and the federal level to make sure that we're training on those issues, right? So that our clerks have some tools to be able to resolve those conflicts, to know who they would reach out to in their communities. We've been working a lot on contingency planning with our local election officials over the last few years too. And so I think the local election officials, the chief inspectors, knowing how they would resolve those issues in their polling places. We've also been doing a lot of work with observer groups and others that are going to be at the polls to make sure that everybody understands the rules and the process, and that, you know, no voter will feel like the polling place is in a welcoming space for them.
Thank you.
Next is a question from Kia Murray.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
All right, well, my question has to do with the Federal Appeals Court that just blocked the decision to extend the deadline for counting absentee ballots in Wisconsin. I mean, whether this is appealed or not, you know, what kind of ramifications is this going to have on voters, the back and forth so close to Election Day?
Well, we've been really careful about that, right? So we've been making sure to not, sort of solidify any of those changes right now, because we still have to figure out exactly what is going to happen upon appeal, and we still need to analyze the decision that came in today as well. So in the interest of certainly not confusing voters, I don't think it's worth going down that path too much, especially at this point before we've had a chance to look at that decision. But we will. We keep looking ahead at some of those implications and what we'll need to do, charting the path for how we're going to communicate what the ultimate decision is to both voters, training our local election officials and our clerks on, you know, what they'll need to consider in those events. So we continue to be very aware of all of that and make sure that we are postured to be able to implement that, to train on that as soon as possible, as soon as we have some finality in those decisions.
And then if I could just ask a quick follow-up, I mean, what does that kind of maneuvering look like? How does training change based on the flip-flopping of the decisions here?
Well, this has happened quite a bit in our state in terms of, there being decisions and us having to train all 1,850 local election officials. So we do have some very well-established communication lines with those local election officials. Even though there's almost 2,000 of them, we talk to them on a regular basis. So we do things like webinars. We have Q&A sessions weekly with our local election officials. We talk through their professional organizations about any changes and give them updates. We send out regular memos and communications and emails to them, letting them know about the status of decisions. And so, we're a well-oiled machine when it comes to making sure that we have to get information out to our local election officials. It's, again, something we've had a lot of practice in and are able to pull together that group of people. And we also rely on them, our local election officials, to get that information out to their voters, right? So we'll continue to engage and update our information if there is a change so that we can reach out to voters. But I think it's equally as important, if not more, for us to give those tools to our local election officials so that they can reach out to voters and let them know what the ultimate decision is and how voters need to operate through that process to be successful.
There aren't any other questions right at the moment. One thing I just add to that is that the court's decision that got stayed would have changed things. So we're back to status quo. Everybody is already trained on what to do normally. So if it changes again, then we'll look at communicating with them about what those changes are.
I think the courts like to issue those rulings right before these media availabilities. I think this is the third time that's happened. So we will have more information once we've done a full analysis.
Okay. Next is Riley Vetterkind.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Cool. So I received an email from a reader who had said that in a local post office, there had been basically a drop box where people who were mailing to the city clerk in the town in which the post office was located, the post office could then just drop those off at the city clerk's office instead of it being routed through Milwaukee. But this person saying apparently they stopped doing that because the USPS wants them going through the mail stream through Milwaukee, which is taking longer. I was just wondering if you've been in contact with the USPS on that, if voters should expect their mail to go through Milwaukee or Minneapolis, or whether it's okay for post offices to directly hand mail to the clerk's office if it's within their own city.
Thanks for the question. So I will not pretend to be a postal service expert, right? We talk with them constantly. We have weekly meetings with the Postal Service to understand their procedures, but I don't want to speak too much as to what their guidance is. But we've heard the same, that their process is that they're supposed to be receiving the mail and then it's routed through the course that it's supposed to take when it's postmarked and sent to a sorting center. So I believe that is the default, and that is also why continuing to amplify the message that voters should return their ballot as soon as possible, because it may take 7 days. It may take 7 days for that mail to be routed, to be sorted, and to be sent back to that community. And so it is also my understanding that, there are some communities where they do hold the mail and then distribute it locally. But whether or not that's a practice that USPS wants them to be following, I'm not sure. But I've heard that their guidance is that they should be routing it through the normal course. And so again, that voters should be prepared that their mail could take 7 days to get back. And so if you're approaching that 7 days, right, and you still have your ballot, then we would really suggest that you find another way to deliver that ballot to your clerk to make sure it's received by 8 p.m. on election day. So be that maybe a drop box in your local community, hand delivering it to your clerk's office or to your polling place or to your central count location is a really good idea as we get closer to that deadline.
Next is Adam Brewster.
Hey, Megan. On the absentee counting boards, forgive me if I'm using central counts, I juggle 2 states and you guys use
Sure.
I know Milwaukee was out there saying yesterday, hey, we're not going to report all of our results from the absentee ballots from the central count until they're all counted. Is that the case for all communities who use those central count facilities? Is it just Milwaukee, or what other major cities would that come from?
Well, we have 30 jurisdictions that use central count. And what central count is, in most jurisdictions, so in the other 1,820, each ballot is sent to the polling place for that voter to be counted with the other ballots at the polling place on election day at their polling place. But in about 30 of our communities, they send all the absentee ballots to one central facility. It's still publicly observable. Still all the processes are followed that would be at the polling place, but all the absentee ballots go to one spot. So you're getting results in from each of the polling places on election night. But then central count is going to have ballots from all of those reporting units that have to be fed into those individual totals, right? And so it does get a little more complicated. And we're working right now actually to put together some guidance for exactly those types of things. Now, the statutes don't outline specifically exactly how those returns have to be sent in on election night, especially if you're working on central count. But we certainly think there's probably some best practices. And we're working with the clerks right now to develop that, to put out some guidance and best practices. And we'll be having a meeting with our commission the week of October 19th to also talk about end of night procedures and to put out guidance on those final best practices.
Do you have any follow-up, Adam?
No, because I guess, so I know Milwaukee said that, but they're the only ones who have come out, I believe, and said that we're going to wait to put everything out until we've counted all of them at that central count facility. And obviously they have more ballots than anyone else.
Right. Yeah, I don't know what the other jurisdictions' plans are for that. Green Bay also uses central count. Some other mid-sized jurisdictions do as well. So, it's certainly a little different. But I think the big thing is that those jurisdictions need to communicate what they're doing, right? They need to communicate how they're going to be putting out those result sets. If they're using central count, I think they have to do a little more work to explain what that means to their voters as well. And so I do anticipate that, as we work to produce some of that guidance about how that process should go, a lot of that is going to be communication focused, because if there's not good communication, that's where some of these rumors sort of grow legs and run off. And so I think communication is just the key. And a lot of this is that those jurisdictions need to be transparent with the public about exactly what their plans are and where they are in the process.
Thank you.
Ashley Brown is next.
Hi there. Thanks so much for doing this yet again. I just had a point of clarification on what you said earlier regarding responses to possible voter intimidation. You said you'd been working on contingency planning with local elections officials. Could you just clarify and describe what some of those contingencies might look like, or what that means?
Well, it depends on the jurisdiction, right? So we've been doing tabletop exercises, which are scenario-based trainings with our local election officials for the last couple of years. And while a lot of them were focused on cybersecurity and what we would do in the event of a cybersecurity emergency, many of them were also physical security related as well. What would happen if there was a disturbance at a polling place? What would happen if you had to move a polling place because it became unavailable? So that could be some kind of natural disaster or some kind of other threat that made that site unavailable. How would you move everything, keep it secure, and also convey to your voters what's happening and where their polling place is? And so those are things that not only have we been talking about with our local election officials, we've actually been practicing, and they actually put together contingency plans as part of the grant program that we did, as part of those trainings. And so what we find in, especially instances of managing that type of situation is that them knowing who they would reach out to in their communities is really the important piece there. When would they call upon law enforcement? When would the chief inspector be trying to de-escalate situations? And making those judgments and communicating is really the key to that. So I think it looks different in every community depending on how they're set up. But I think that they've been doing a lot of work to understand and to put together sort of that plan for what they would do in those events. And we're going to continue to work with them on that too, specifically through the lens of this November 2020 election. We've got some more guidance and training planned in the coming weeks for the local election officials on situations like that, so that we can again discuss those and make sure that they're considering that as part of their contingency plan.
Got it. And would you say that every precinct, every county, do you feel confident that statewide they've got that contingency plan or have taken part in some of this training? Or do you feel like it's maybe not statewide at this point?
Well, it's not required, but we do know that the majority of them have partaken in that. So it was a requirement of the security grant, for example, that we did. If they accepted funding from us, then they had to complete one of our tabletop exercise trainings. They also had to submit their contingency plans to us as part of that as well. So I think the vast majority of them have, and it's been a really helpful exercise, again, for them to go through it. A lot of them actually write their contingency plans with their poll workers during poll worker training, so that again, they can all sort of exercise that. So I don't know exactly how many do or don't. They're not required to report that to us, but it is something that I feel quite confident that most of our jurisdictions take very seriously, and that they're thinking of these things and they're planning for them.
Thank you.
Next is Ellie Kaufman. Ellie, you have to unmute yourself.
Hey guys, I'm sorry. My question for you, this is Ellie Kaufman with CNN. My question for you is, I know several states in Wisconsin have received funding from this organization called the Center for Tech and Civic Life. And I know that there's one ongoing lawsuit in Wisconsin about this, claiming that this money has only gone to Democratic specific areas, even though the money has just gone to the 5 most populous states. And I'm wondering if you guys have a response to that lawsuit and just have any comment on funding that you've received from this organization.
So the state has not received any funding from any outside organization. So the state of Wisconsin has not received any fundings from that organization or from any other third parties. We have received funding from the feds in terms of CARES grant funding and the Help America Vote Act funding that was received for cybersecurity. We've certainly received those, but we haven't received any other funding. I can't speak to other municipal jurisdictions' decisions about that. I know that there's been some questions that have been brought to our office, but we certainly don't have any sort of jurisdiction over that particular matter. So, I would really defer to those municipalities for them to, discuss what their decision-making process was with their local decision makers in accepting those funds and their plans for use.
Okay, thank you.
I think Laura Schulte has another question.
Hi, yes. So another question about poll watchers. We had a reader submit a question asking, are poll watchers legally allowed to carry guns?
So we are working through, again, some of that guidance. So we actually have trainings scheduled with some of the political parties and their organizers to talk about observer programs and what is it and isn't allowed. And I'm also not an expert on things like firearm laws, but I do know that there are rules set by individual polling places and jurisdictions in terms of their municipal buildings that might be utilized. And so I would say that voters should, of course, look for those postings to understand what is and isn't allowed in those public spaces, but that we will be putting out additional guidance as well. But I don't know that there is a blanket answer for that question. And I think it takes a little more careful analysis before we can give more information there.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We're wide open here. While we're waiting for more questions, one thing I will say is that yesterday we posted the list of polling places around the state on our website. And if you look under the, when I send out the video link to this, I'll send a link to where that list is. We have 2,408 polling places. So if you want that list, you can certainly get it. Although, when it comes to having voters find their own polling places, we very much like for them to use the My Vote website, because it makes sure they know exactly where to go, because you can't always tell that from a spreadsheet.
Yeah, good point. And we've also been collecting, and I think we might have talked about this last week, but we're also collecting in-person absentee locations and hours from our local election officials. So they're not required to provide that information to us, but it looks like the vast majority of them have provided that information. It's not available in just one big list, but it is available to voters when they look up their voter record, if that jurisdiction has provided it. So that's new information, and hopefully something that'll be useful to voters. Same with drop boxes. If they provide us with information on Dropbox opportunities, we can also post that for the voters on My Vote.
Next is Alexa from the Wall Street Journal.
Hey, Megan. Thanks for doing these. You may have mentioned it when you were talking about getting poll workers, but Wisconsin is seeing kind of higher cases of coronavirus. Are you, thinking about what might happen if that situation worsens? It could, people who are signing up now might not be willing to be poll workers if cases keep rising. What guidance are you giving to local election officials as they try to plan for that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That is actually something we've been talking extensively with our local election officials about in the last few weeks. So I've been doing webinars with our clerks, as well as some of the professional organizations for municipalities and counties, to talk about just that. Again, that it's not enough to just have enough poll workers, right? If a polling place needs 5 poll workers to open the doors, they should be planning to have 10, just in case there are emergencies, or in case people are unable to show or don't feel comfortable. A lot can happen in a month, right? A lot could shift in terms of people's level of comfort, potentially navigating public spaces. And so we really are encouraging the local election officials to not just plan to have enough, but to plan for those emergencies, to know who they're going to call, where they're going to go to in the event that someone cannot show on election day. Even in August, we saw that in some communities where people didn't feel comfortable showing up to be poll workers on election day, despite their commitment previously. And so I think that each of our communities really needs to plan for that possibility. I've been talking a lot to municipal decision makers in our towns, villages, and cities, as well as our counties, about that as well, about how this is a municipal responsibility in terms of not just making sure you have enough, but making sure that you have a backup to turn to in the event of an emergency, and that they should be utilizing, be it other municipal or potentially county employees, to help serve in those emergency roles. Getting people trained ahead of election day. We have online training curriculum for poll workers that they could have their municipal employees take beforehand in the event that someone's needed to fill in a gap on election day. And so, yeah, absolutely. That's a message that we've been bringing loud and clear to our local election officials. And I think that our clerks and our local election officials very much are working towards that goal. And we're also hoping to get the support of their communities, the support of their municipal leadership as well, to make sure that they're prepared for having that backup.
All right, any other questions? Anybody else? We've got 15 minutes, or we can get back to work, but we can all get back to work. Anything else you wanted to add, Megan? Oh, so Alexa has another question.
Sure. Yeah, I'll hop in. Ballot challenges, there's been a lot of, questions about just with observers from campaigns, how that process works. if you all are counting, I guess at central count or at polling places, like what are the rules for campaign representatives to challenge absentee ballots as they're counted? Is that something you all do? I know it really differs by state.
Yeah, there is certainly a challenge process where somebody's able to present a challenge either to a voter that's casting their ballot at the polls on election day, or that is that is challenging potentially an absentee ballot. That seems like a good topic, maybe for another day too. I like the idea of maybe talking about observer rules and then the challenge process, and making sure that voters and people that might be observing understand what the challenge process entails, and that frivolous challenges are certainly not something that are allowed either. But I don't have the whole process outlined in front of me, but I think that's a really good topic for maybe another day.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Ellie, you had a question?
Hey, just really fast. When does online voter registration right now close?
The 14th of October.
Okay, thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. And then after that, of course, voters can still register to vote in person at their clerk's office or at the polls on election day.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Savannah Tomei.
Hi, thank you as always. I was just wondering if there's been any response from clerks or from voters about the barcodes now that so many people have been able to send their absentee ballots back, kind of what they've been thinking about being able to track it and how that's gone.
Yeah, I think it's gone really well so far. I think there's been certainly allowed voters some additional transparency into the process. We've had voters that have been able to contact their local election officials when things haven't maybe progressed along the timeline. I'm not aware of anything widespread like that, but there certainly are always cases where maybe somebody doesn't receive something they were expecting, and they're able to contact the clerk to get a ballot reissued, to get that one canceled. And so I think it is really helpful in that respect. And I think it also helps us to, of course, have that peace of mind that there haven't been any widespread instances of that happening, because we're able to pull reports on a regular basis to make sure everything's progressing how it should be. We're not seeing things that aren't progressing along a normal course. We saw some ballots, that I think took an unusual path, but ended up where they needed to go in some very small instances. So I think it's providing us a lot of information, but most importantly, it provides that transparency and that accountability so that everybody knows where their ballot is at in the process. And so I think voters have appreciated having that additional information. Clerks have appreciated having that too. So again, they have that peace of mind that nothing has gone awry in the process, and that they can help voters in the event that something unusual does happen.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anything else? Well, I'm not seeing any. We'll do this again next Thursday, same time, 1 o'clock. After this, I will send out a link with the video if you want to use any of it, as well as a link to where that polling place list is. So thanks very much. Anything else you want to add, Meagan?
No, just thanks as always. Appreciate it. And we'll talk to you all next week.
All right.
This program is a production of Wisconsin Eye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. Wisconsin Eye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civics broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.